Well, we finished war in Europe, but there's that other half of the world that you forgot about. The Western Hemisphere. Actually, kind of straddles the Western and Eastern because the international date line goes right through the middle anyway. There's a whole half of the planet. The Pacific Ocean area of a war in Asia, the war with Japan. So on the original outline, this was G, completing the defeat of Japan, and it kind of starts with 1945. So it's originally laid out. The lecture stopped with Pearl Harbor and didn't come back to Japan until 1945. Wow, that's just madness, I tell you. Sheer madness, so let's try to correct that. Alright, so something kind of seemingly random, kind of out of the ordinary. I'm just going to kind of slide it in here. It involves the War of Japan. We talked about the European theater of operations. That's Europe. The Pacific theater of operations. That's the Pacific. Of course, there's the Russian situation, but that's not involving the Americans. I'm going to mention, just in passing, a very unknown part of the war to most Americans, and that's the China, Burma, India theater of operations, usually abbreviated the CBI, the China, Burma, India theater of operations. Now, one reason most Americans don't know much about this is there aren't that many Americans involved in it. It's really more of a British show. Which makes sense because here is India, which is, of course, at the time, a British colony. Okay, here's China up here. Okay, and of course, we were trying to keep China in the war. Okay, so most of what goes on in the CBI involves British troops. But several years ago, a friend of mine's son was working on a report for a school class, and he had found out that his great uncle or someone like that had been in the CBI, and of course he's like, oh, so he did a report on it. Most people haven't heard of it. Okay, there are a handful of American combat troops in the CBI, very small numbers of infantry. There are some Air Force units. A lot of the Flying Tigers ended up staying in India, in the India area, and working. Going back into the United States Army Air Force and serving there. Some of Doolittle's raiders ended up working out of India, okay, in the early year of the war. But it's almost always, it's really more of a British show. But I'm going to mention it just because, you never know. Somebody might say to you someday, hey, your great-grandfather was in World War II, who's in the CBI, and you're going, oh, okay, so now this puts you ahead of most Americans walking the street today. Now, I said there are some ground troops in the CBI, not many. There's some Air Force units. The main contribution that the United States has in this area, okay, is helping to get supplies into China. You could send supplies up the so-called Burma Road, which is a very long, twisted, mountainous route. It's hard to move supplies on at various times, so Japanese cut it. Okay. So one thing, though, Americans are doing is flying supplies into China. They have to fly across the Himalayas, okay, which are very tall mountains. Okay. It's called flying the hump. Here's an airplane. This is a Curtiss C-46 Commando. It's a cargo airplane. And a lot of these were used to fly supplies into China, and other planes too, of course. Okay, American pilots would fly supplies. You can see here. See the mountains below? Okay. Flying through the mountains in these, by our standards, primitive aircraft. There are casualties. If you're a transport pilot and you fly into a mountain in the fog and you're killed, you're a casualty of World War II, even though you weren't in combat. So that's the main thing going on in the CBI. It's, like I said, really a sideshow as far as Americans go, but I thought I would mention it. But the big show is out in the Pacific. Erase that line. Okay, so I showed you this map earlier, okay, but it's back again. It's hard to read the little names and numbers on the screen, but the blue arrows are really what we want to focus on here, okay? Let me get my pen ready. Okay, so we're working a Europe first strategy. Now, we're mostly supposed to be playing defense in the Pacific, but what we do find is that America has enough supplies and manpower to go ahead and launch offensives against Japan as well. They're always lower priority than Europe, but I mean, the Navy, for instance, doesn't have a lot to do other than escort ships across the Atlantic. So, the aircraft carriers, the big battleships are all working out in the Pacific. And here's what will kind of happen. When I left you in the Pacific, we were at the very end of 1942, going into the beginning of 1943. And I told you we were down here at Guadalcanal, which we talked about Guadalcanal. Okay. After Guadalcanal is secured early in 1943, we start looking for other places to go. Okay. And what we actually end up with, okay, Douglas MacArthur, the Army general who had been in charge of the Philippines defense in the early days of war, is based in Australia. Okay, his goal, he wants to go back to the Philippines. Okay, he had left his men there. A lot of them are in prisoner of war camps. The Filipinos are suffering under Japanese occupation, and he'd made a promise to return. So MacArthur, what's driving MacArthur is the idea of getting back to the Philippines. All right. The Navy, however, has a different idea. Okay? The Navy, of course, is under the command of Chester Nimitz. I told you should know him. He's from Fredericksburg, Texas, working out of Pearl Harbor here. Okay? The Navy wants to go to Formosa. This is Formosa right here. It's a big island off the coast of China. Okay? The Navy figures if they can get to Formosa, they could use that as a base for an eventual invasion of Japan up here. Okay, so the Navy wants to go to Formosa, and the Army wants to go. MacArthur wants to go to the Philippines. There's actually a big meeting, for kind of pursuing this both ways. Get a little ahead of myself on the meeting. What happens is we have enough troops that we go with a dual approach. So there's two blue arrows on this map here. This arrow, the bottom arrow, bottom line, represents the army under MacArthur. Okay? So MacArthur working basically mostly with army airplanes and army troops, although there are occasionally some Marines involved. And he does need naval support to move his men around. So there's a Navy operating with MacArthur. Will start working their way towards the Philippines. The islands in this part of the world tend to be a little larger, so the campaigns are longer, there's more maneuvering, and ends up both the Navy and MacArthur will end up doing something we call island hopping. We quickly realize that we don't have to capture every Japanese-held island. You just need certain ones. If you can find an unoccupied island that's big enough to build an airbase on, that's great. Grab that. Put an airbase on it. Some islands are key strategic locations that the Japanese have, and you can't afford to have them, in your way, and you'll have to attack them. So sometimes we'll grab an island that's basically undefended. Other times we'll grab an island that's got heavy defenses and it turns into a fight. And then other times we will bypass islands completely and leave the Japanese garrison there to just wither. Right? You skip, for instance, well, I won't give you a bunch of names, it just confuse you. But skip over a Japanese stronghold, okay? Build, seize an island, 100 miles further up the way there, put an airbase on it, send bombers back to the Japanese-held island every so often, drop bombs on them to keep them, entertained, let them know we know we're there, and they're basically just cut off, and they can no longer serve any useful purpose in war. This is known as island hopping. So as you jump from island to island, you jump over one island, maybe two islands, come back to an island, whatever you need to do. And both the Army working out of Australia and the Navy working in the Pacific do this. So Nimitz's prom goes up through here. Now these islands tend to be smaller. Okay, this is mostly working with the Marine Corps. Okay, although sometimes Army troops are involved. And it turns out like, so we have enough men and supplies and the ships that we can pursue both things. This helps keep the Japanese off balance. They never really know where we're going next. And at some point, we'll have to make a decision. Meanwhile, we're pursuing this dual strategy. Okay, two approaches to working our way up towards Japan. All right. Now, there's all kinds of epic naval battles which we won't go into because it's not a World War II class, much as I would love it to be one. I will mention this. Some of these are just absolute bloodbaths. Okay, I mean just nasty, nasty battles here, for instance. But in June of '44, about the same time Americans are landing in Normandy, France, Nimitz's forces grab the Marianas Islands here. Okay, this includes Guam, which had been an American possession before the war. So there's the three big islands are Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. Seizure of these islands is critical because there's a new 4-engine bomber the Army Air Force has been working on. It's called the B-29 Superfortress. Okay, it has much longer range than anything we've had up to this point. And these islands are close enough to Japan that B-29's base on these islands can fly to Japan, bomb Japan, and then come back to the Marianas. So now Japan is in range of American aerial attack. Okay, this happens in the early summer of 1944. Now, remember, MacArthur wants to go back to the Philippines. The Navy wants to go to Formosa. At some point, they're going to have to decide. So there's a big conference held. All the big people are there. And MacArthur convinces Roosevelt. I think Roosevelt was there. But anyway, MacArthur convinces the head guys, which would be the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And I think Roosevelt would have been involved in the decision even if he wasn't at the meeting. To go to the Philippines. American prestige depends on it. We've left our men in prisoner of war camps. We had promised to protect the Filipinos and we failed. We really need the Philippines. And so the Navy will give up on the Formosa idea. Okay? Now, when we had invaded Saipan and Tinian and Guam, there had been a huge naval engagement fought off the islands that greatly reduced the power of the Japanese Navy. They had never really recovered from Midway. And then this battle is another big American victory and really sets them back. Okay? So you'll see on your map here that there's this little blue line where Nimitz's forces peel off and go over to help MacArthur re-enter the Philippines. So the big naval task force that are normally working with Nimitz will go to the Philippines for the big invasion of the Philippines. And this will trigger something called the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. I don't speak Filipino. Actually, Filipinos speak Tagalog. But I don't know if Leyte is Spanish or Tagalog or what, to be honest. Okay, but in the fall of 1944, September-ish, October-ish, we launched this invasion of the Philippines in an attempt to recapture it from the Japanese. Okay, this will trigger a massive naval battle called the Battle of Leyte Gulf. I didn't put the exact date on here because this battle is so big, it's actually like 4 separate naval battles. Okay, off the coast of the Philippines. So these are like 4 distinctive separate engagements. Okay, over the course of 3 or 4 days, I suppose. This is the biggest naval battle fought with ships in history. Okay, it's huge. And when it's done, the Japanese Navy is basically effectively finished as a fighting force. Okay? After this, it's just scraps, dribbles and drabs, a stray ship here, a stray ship there. So the Japanese Navy is really no longer in any condition to try to resist the American offenses in the Pacific. And MacArthur does return to the Philippines. I told you he's a bit of a showboater. Doesn't fly in. He wades ashore from the landing craft, goes up to where a microphone's been set up, and he says, "I have returned." All right, so he's fulfilled his promise, and we have liberated the Philippines. Although fighting will continue in the Philippines for months and months and months, because it's a really big island. And this is in the fall of 1944. We'll pause here and switch to a new video.